Welcome to the Developmental, a podcast about the messy, beautiful ways grown-ups grow up. Here, we explore turning the science into the day-to-day practice of adult development in teams, homes, organizations, and life. Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Developmental. Those of you who are following our Substack newsletter, which you can find at verticaldevelopment.education, might have read a recent article I wrote exploring some of the prevailing and, in my opinion, unhelpful myths that float around in the developmental consulting space. One such myth is that adult, vertical development is exclusively an individual journey. According to this myth, people can be supported to develop into later stages regardless of their context. In extreme versions of this myth, it's even suggested that some recipe might exist to shift whole cohorts of leaders into later stages and thus impact organizational culture. While this myth has been actively dismissed by all established developmental researchers I know of, it's still surfacing in commercial conversations. It leads some organizations and consultants to put the onus of change on the individual while ignoring the complex contexts which impact how individuals behave. This individualistic view of development has drawn significant amount of criticism from researchers and consultants in the complexity science or systems space, who advocate for a view of change that favors a systems perspective. These people sometimes even dismiss the individual perspective as irrelevant, thus inhabiting the opposite pole in what turns out to be a polarity. My 15 years of experience as both facilitator and coach, working with both organizations in groups, large and small, as well as individually with hundreds of leaders, have shown me that neither of these extreme views seem to be the full picture. System and individual seem to be inextricably connected, and in my experience, trying to influence one in isolation from the other is futile. So I have set out to both explore this myth of development as function of the individual in more detail and seek to invite an alternative perspective that can both illuminate the role of the system while also honoring the individual. On today's episode, I'm thrilled to dialogue with a guest whose work I deeply admire and who I believe holds precious wisdom at the intersection of these two fields, individual development and systemic change. Joan Lurie is the founder and CEO of Orgonomics, an organization strategy and leadership development consultancy she established in 2008 to help leaders and organizations develop, perform, and transform. Joan is a Fulbright scholar with a master's degree in adult education and a second master's degree in developmental psychology. She works with boards, executives, and leadership teams to help them develop systemic intelligence and design and lead complex adaptive change in their organizations with turnaround results. The Orgonomics methodology Joan created is a novel theory and practice for organizations which integrates strategy, systems thinking, complexity, and adult development theory. It provides an ecological map for leaders to navigate the unique challenges they face and be fit for the current complex landscape they are in. Joan will talk more about what the ecology that she refers to is and why having this awareness of belonging to a broader system is actually so important, particularly in today's context. Together we'll explore what it means to take a systems perspective on development, what other lenses beyond the individual are worth exploring, and what might all of us, leaders, HR experts, consultants, facilitators, coaches, researchers, learn from honoring this polarity of individual and system and consciously navigating it instead of favoring one pole at the exclusion of the other. I can't wait to hear what you all think, so please share your reflections in the comments section on the episode page on Substack at verticaldevelopment.education. And if you're finding value in these conversations and have yet not subscribed to our Substack newsletter, please do and join our growing community of learners and curious explorers of human development. So with all that said, here is Joan Lurie. Joan, welcome on the Developmental. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. Very excited to be here too.
I feel this is one more of a nerd's dream fulfilled. Because I've been following your work for a good few years, and I feel there are so many fascinating intersections between the systems perspective and the more individual perspective in adult development. So I've reached out inviting you with the intention for us to explore these intersections in a way where we turn the theory into lived experience.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think we need more and more exploration and dialogue about these interweavings and intersections, which are helpful. So, yeah, really honor the work that you're doing in this space. Thank you, Alice.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. Likewise. Maybe if I zoom out a little bit, just to recount how I've discovered your work and what made me curious, and maybe even the broader context of the field right now that I feel asks for more dialogue and more cross-pollination. So I was participant in a workshop where you were introducing ergonomics and the perspective that you take on organizations as systems, and what does it look like to create a more conscious maybe system. This is my word, maybe I'm not sure if it's the word you would use, but for me it was, Joan is talking about how organizations are growing up in a sense, and I'm interested in how individuals grow up, and individuals never grow up in isolation. So that really sparked my curiosity as to where the intersection is between these two. And the more I've spent time in this space, the more I see this almost polarization between people who favor a systems perspective on human development and organizational and cultural development and so on, and people who are very, very interested in the individual perspective. And at times it seems like they're at odds with each other. And I keep having this sense of, we're missing a bigger picture here. If it's a polarity, maybe there's a higher perspective we're missing. So I would love to know how you got to the discovery of systems, because I know you came at it from a developmental psychology background. So what drew you to the other pole? How did that come about for you?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I think in some ways they emerged for me simultaneously.
Mm,
I was doing a master's in adult education and development at Wits University in Johannesburg, and in the late 80s, early 90s, and mostly I was looking at obviously adult development theory, but in the context of apartheid, where most adults in South Africa hadn't had the opportunity to go to school, or if they had, it was very limited. Like they only went up to primary schooling. But we were moving into we were going through a transition into post-apartheid South Africa, and more in organizational context and in the political and social context, there was obviously a requirement for redress and an opportunity for adults to get more education, but they couldn't go back to school, obviously. So what I was very curious about at the time was how are adults able to learn and progress without going back to school, and was looking at the union movements, adult night schools, how organizations and businesses were accountable and responsible for some of that. And one of the key things was that adults were using children's books, whether they were in union context or organizations or night schools, churches, things like that. And that was deeply troubling to me, that adults had to learn with children's material. And so I started doing my research into what would an adult curriculum look like. And the opportunity came where a very visionary CEO was doing a transformation in his organization. And he gave me space to research what an adult curriculum might look like and how we can use organizations as contexts for adult development and education. And so began my exploration of how to create that, what that would look like. And whilst I was doing that research for my master's, I was invited to be part of a transformation team that were looking at breaking down racism in the company, preparing it for a post-apartheid South Africa. And so I got involved in doing the culture change work simultaneously. And that was then intriguing to me because I was looking at how to use organizations as context for adult learning and adult development. And then I got hooked into this thing of, well, how do you change organizational culture? And so the two streams came together in this context, in this beautiful, interplay between the two. And so I got really curious about these questions around how do we use organizations as contexts and containers for development? How do we help organizations change? And as part of that, how can organizations be used as context for change in the wider kind of political and social context? So those three questions are ones that interweave very powerfully for me and have, since that time, absolutely intrigued me. As part of that work, the CEO, a couple of years into that work, also knew that he had to change the operating model of the company and merge 4 businesses into one. And he brought out Irving Borwick to work with us, who had been exploring the application of systems theory and systems work based on Gregory Bateson's work, family systems work, etc., into applying that into organizational context. And so he came to work with us, and he had developed an application of systems which was coming out of kind of more Bateson, biological, Maturana, Varela, those kind of traditions. And some family systems work, but not doing therapy and not doing family systems in organizations, but he had reinvented it. And that opened my eyes to a completely new way of understanding organizations as complex systems and doing change in organizations that is not individual, not psychological, not therapeutic, but rather really looking at the system of the organization and shifting that. And as part of that, I had the opportunity then to go and I got a Fulbright and got an opportunity to go and do a master's in developmental psych. And I looked at how to shift people's meaning making from more lineal analytical binary into more systemic, relational, being able to see and make sense of the world in this very different, more abductive way. And I used a piece of the work that we'd been doing in this company in South Africa as the context for research. So yeah, that's a bit of how my story and the interweavings began.
I love how we end up doing the work, and the work is doing us in a sense. And your backstory resonates so powerfully for me because I'm originally from Romania and have grown up in the last decade of communism and then in the post-communist era, and there was a before and after where the external environment completely shifted and the whole of society as an organism had to adapt. And then for me, it was always a question of how do individuals actually adapt when the whole world has completely changed around them, and what served them up until December last year, literally, if I think December 1989, is no longer serving them now. And then how does this interweaving between individual adaptation and systemic adaptation actually occur? So, and I think in a sense we're seeing this now after the pandemic again and again. Like this whole world is shifting and the system is shifting, and then yes, what does that interweaving look like? And I have so many questions that are popping up, but I'm curious, how do you see this interweaving happening? I mean, how do you, what have you learned really? Maybe that's the best question to start with, as you've started to study how systems shift and individuals become, and meaning making in the individual shifts. What have you learned about that interweaving?
So much. It's
a big question.
I think one of the key things that that I was sort of, my eyes were opened up to, let me put it that way, was a different conceptualization of what is an organization at that time. That an organization is a system, is a complex system, and that an organization is in some ways a network of roles, role relations, implicit and explicit rules of engagement that have come to be between different members or parts of the system. And so that was transformational for me, not to see organizations simply as a set of technical structures and processes or as a collection of people who are in interpersonal relationship, but this kind of third additional lens, which was to see organizations as complex networks.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of that, a kind of linked idea that the Borwicks introduced me to was an idea that, you know, when we're in a system, an organizational system, we connect into that system by virtue of the role that we contract to take up. And by role, I don't mean the technical job role that we contract for. Of course, there is that. But also the systemic roles that we get invited in to play and that we take up in the network of role relations. And one of the key ideas about this is that we immediately form as individuals in organizational systems. When we connect and join with them, we immediately form a set of assumptions, a mental map of the system, the network of relations, how it's working, how it should work, where we fit in it, our role in it. And mostly that, and after doing this work for 30 years and inviting people into drawing that map, how they see it, I know that we all form those maps. It's like if we land in a new city or in a new suburb or in the jungle, wherever we are, we form a map in our minds. We orient to, you know, where we are. And
Yep.
that kind of orientation, that form of mapping, is also happening in organizational territories, in organizational systems and contexts. But mostly individuals don't know that they are.
It's an unconscious map.
In the main, it is not visible to us.
Yep.
So there's kind of an interesting kind of move that happens when we start knowing that we hold a map. That's a kind of first move to hold more as object. So we no longer simply navigate the organization and our world through the map as a filter, but we know we have it. So that creates the opportunity for us to stand back from the map with some curiosity and discover what map am I holding?
Yeah.
What does my map look like of the system in which I am a part? And the second is to test whether that map is 100% accurate.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I think the beautiful thing about what Korzybski said was the map isn't the territory. We are constructing our maps, and they're not necessarily the territory, but we tend to assume that our maps are the territory that we're navigating. And we also tend to assume that they're true and that others hold the same maps and that others should, if they don't, they should.
Yeah.
So it is a map of the system and ourselves in it that I'm talking about quite specifically. We do hold maps, obviously, and constructs of other territories and other, contexts, but I'm specifically referring to the maps that we're holding of the organizational systems we are in, or the systems that we are a part of more broadly, our family systems, our social systems, etc. And so it's important, what I discovered and how this sort of came to be is that the map in some ways informs the territory, because
It
the maps,
informs our behavior. What we assume to be true would inform our behavior, right?
absolutely, it informs our
Yeah.
behavior, but it also informs the system and the territory. And that's where this kind of interplay, this dance comes to be, because how we're framing, how we're constructing that territory as individuals informs the outcome, what emerges. And to what
Mm-hmm.
degree our maps, the individual maps, are coherent or not, informs the territory and the system. So we're in this beautiful kind of dynamic dance between constructing the maps, informing the system, and the system holding a collective kind of assumption about the roles and how the rules of engagement and the contracts that should be, and that informing individual maps.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this kind of very important continual dynamic of informing each other around getting this kind of emergent outcome for how things are
Yeah.
in organizations.
So would you say, just taking my understanding here, that the collection of these mostly unconsciously held maps, in a sense, forms organizational culture? It's like the intricacy that what I assume to be true about, I don't know, who holds power here, what's expected of me, what is said versus actually expected, which is often not exactly the same thing. All of that collection of beliefs of individuals, and then the collectively held beliefs, then the interweaving of those, would that be where culture emerges in this perspective?
Yeah. So culture will, from my perspective and from a more complex systems perspective, culture emerges from this kind of continual dynamic patterning that is taking place between the members or subsystems or parts of the organizational system, and how they are in continual construction
Mm-hmm.
of each other. Yes, absolutely. It is from those complex interactions that culture emerges. And I talk about 7 culture myths because I think in organizations, what has come to be held deeply is that what drives people's behavior is their values, and their styles and their preferences, and organizational values. And I think that is a kind of mythical assumption that has been deeply held for too long, and we need to disrupt it, because in
Mm-hmm.
fact behavior and culture emerges from this network of interactions and relations, as much more so, I believe, than from a set of values that is held either individually or collectively.
Yeah. And if by value we mean the spouse values, the ones that we write on the walls and we kind of want to adhere to as principles, but then in actuality, quite often we're not embodying those values in our behaviors, which I think is an ongoing story we see.
Yeah, yeah, and often that incoherence is obviously a big part of the problem.
Yeah. Where would you say that the developmental or adult development in the individual sense plays a role in how people construct these mental maps, Joan?
Well, I think they are connected. So I think that where people's sort of sense making and meaning making about self will inform the maps that they hold about the system and their place in it, and what the rules of engagement are and what is required of them. And I think that's a very important thing for us to understand, is that those where kind of people's meaning making are about self will inform the maps and therefore inform the system, but equally how the systemic assumptions about the roles people should play and how they should behave informs where people will be pulled into development.
Yeah,
So again, it's this very circular dance between
relationship.
the two. Yeah, they are in complex interrelationship.
I'd love to, if you'd like to maybe dive a little bit deeper on this interrelatedness. And we were touching on it before we started the recording about the gravitational pull of culture. And it's something we talk a lot about in the developmental space. And in particular, I can think of Val Livesey, whose work on fallback informs a lot of our understanding of how people actually don't show up as their measurable, like their full developmental capacity. It's one thing to test somebody and assess them as potentially operating at a certain stage, and it's a whole different thing to see that person in day-to-day interaction in an organizational context. And they might not show up as that mature self that they are capable of. And Valerie talks about the gravitational pull of culture as one element that, puts people into fallback or elicits behaviors that are not aligned with how that person might show up in an ideal context. And quite often when we look at post-conventional leaders in particular, there's this term in the research, redefiners in hiding, people who have the capacity to question, to reflect, to inquire into the system, but they show up as more, black and white, expert kind of driven mindset, because that's what the organization expects of them. So how do you illuminate those those threads when you go into an organization and work with a team?
Yeah.
How does that play out?
I mean, obviously I have the adult development lens, and I'm often applying it myself to making sense of and understanding, how people are making sense generally about the problems that they're facing, but also about themselves in the context that they find themselves in, how they make meaning about that. But I don't often necessarily even introduce ideas of adult development theory, and because I, in some ways, don't know that it's necessary.
Yep.
I do think that it's important to be aware of where there is a kind of matching or mismatching potentially, and how that incoherence can be problematic. But often most of my work at the systems level is to help systems, whether that is a system of two, or a system of 7, a team, or a system of 100, a division, or whether it's the whole organizational system. A lot of my work is based on this idea that it's very helpful for the system to step back from itself and be able to observe itself from a second order position. And one of the practices that I introduce is this idea that let's try and step back and observe the system as you're seeing it and describe it as you're seeing it, knowing that your description is only a description. Yep. And the invitation is to individuals to share their descriptions in a neutral way, not to, ask the question, what's wrong here or what's the problem here, but simply to invite people into observation and to sharing their descriptions with one another. Mm-hmm. And to coming to kind of a shared sense of whether their descriptions are more similar or more different. And one of the techniques that I use with that is I invite people to share their observations as hypotheses. And so what this does as a practice is it invites people into description which is hypothetical, which is actually, this is my
takes
way.
A bit of the heat out of diagnosing or feeling like you're labeling the system in some way.
It takes out the analytical diagnostic component. Let's look for what's working well, what's working not well. And then it invites people immediately, that kind of question invites people into an analysis, looking for root cause, looking for what the problem is and fixing. What this alternative work is inviting people into observation of how it is. No, the question isn't what's working, what's not working. Rather, the question is, How is the system functioning at this point in time? What are you observing? What are you noticing? And so the invitation, if we link back to role, is not to invite people into expert, into fixer, into diagnostician. The invitation to leaders is to step into role of discoverer, into role of learner, into role of observer, more from a neutral place to begin. And so I think that that invitation into role of explorer, discoverer, stepping back from observing their own meaning making, observing their own hypotheses, putting those out for testing, that is a very powerful subject-object move that is being set up in the context of a team, of a division, of a whole organization. And many of my ergonomics practices are invitations into that space.
Yeah.
And I think what's so liberating about that is that it invites people out of being stuck in their own constraints around how they're viewing the world, how they're viewing the world together and separately, and to start building interconnectivity and interrelational meaning making, an ability to be able to hold and see distinction, and a whole lot of practices which are not individual, they're actually practices that we are inviting the system into. And I believe that doing that work will in some ways invite individuals, or does invite individuals into that place, but not from a teleological improve, grow you into some, bigger you in an adult development sense. I don't even have to talk about that because the purpose is different.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the end of the day, as long as you are ongoingly making object that which you were subject to before, growth is happening. You don't even have to necessarily create a set of boxes to kind of determine, what's the name for this, wherever we are now. I am curious though, Joan, to explore with you what how you're noticing people. Maybe to give a bit of context to that question, something that I'm really interested in, fascinated by, is the role of emotions in the developmental unfolding, which is something that in traditional developmental research is not that much explored as a thing. We talk about subject-object shifts more as a cognitive thing. You realize you see something that you weren't seeing before. But what I found in my research and also in my practice of facilitation is that where we get hung up a lot is the difficult emotions that arise when our worldviews are being challenged, even by ourselves. Even through well-meaning inquiry, I discovered that what I believed, I'm even imagining, if you realize that the role you've created for yourself or the projection of what you think that role is, you're kind of starting to see, that actually isn't what it is. It's something else. There's cognitive dissonance that kicks in, and with that comes emotion. And what I found was that when people lean into that difficult emotion with curiosity, that's when further curiosity and further reflection is unlocked. But when they don't, there seems to be a stuckness setting in where we kind of externalizing the problem, or, it's like people don't seem to lean into a process of discovery that challenges their worldviews unless they're supported to hold space for the nasty emotions that pop up. So I'm curious from your perspective, what do you notice about that and how that plays out?
It's such a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that I notice, like I've had a few of these examples in the last couple of weeks, as people discover that what is happening as you introduce this idea that that you are in a role in a system, and that often people's upset or noise or conflict between people, which feels deeply personal, is actually about a systemic incoherence around how we're making assumptions about roles, rules of engagement, the contract between us. often because people don't have that sense-making lens, the attribution when noise emerges is that it's personal. They're upset with me. They don't like me. They're judging me. And people, I feel, get pulled back into their smaller selves when that starts to happen.
It's threatening. It's a threatening feeling.
It feels threatening. They feel like they're not showing up well. They think the problem is them. They feel like the problem is being made personal, or the attribution is the problem sits with another person, or the problem is between those two people. A lack of trust, a lack of respect. Like the meaning making is interpersonal and it feels quite individual about me. But when you introduce this alternative lens, what is so helpful is that it helps people diffuse the self from the role and from that particular role relational context. And so I had someone who recently came to me and said they were very upset. They were very really questioning their own competence. They felt like they had come from one context where they were thriving, they were fully in their power, so to speak, in their language. They felt like they had authority, they knew what they were doing. And then they've changed roles and they've come into another context, and suddenly they feel incompetent. They feel like they're operating from their smallest self. Their whole sense of self and confidence has fallen through the floor. And the whole meaning making is quite personal about them as an individual. But when they get this lens and they start to make sense of the sense making that's going on in relation to them and what's going on in the system, and they're able to step back from that and see the relatedness and the patterning and how they're connecting into the system, what that invites is a completely different meaning making about self. Which is less personal, which is less about me, and actually enables her to kind of get pulled back into her sense of self, which is no longer, I'm bad, I've done something wrong, I'm the problem here.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm saying is that as you help people make these subject-object moves systemically and know that they are always in a context, in a system, in a role, and that patterning has as much to do with who they are personally, that pulls people into a sort of more meta self where they can make sense of self in a more relational way, rather than it's purely about them as an individual. And so a whole lot of the emotions that come from the meaning making about self can be sort of sidestepped somewhat and held in a completely different way, because they're able to see self in system, in role. And so that kind of diffuses and de-triggers a lot of the kind of emotion that's happening. So I think that this systemic work, the subject-object move, actually helps a lot with making emotions more object, and how emotions might be not 100% valid when you start to look at what's going on with a more systems lens.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And the kind of the question that pops up for me is, so this when people are feeling over responsible for things, that can help take away some of that weight, in a sense where you can actually realize, oh, it's not just about me, I'm part of the system. So then I get curious about that intersection. What happens when people don't own their part in how they are impacting the system, and maybe don't see their role in putting some energy, good or bad, in the system? How does the awareness of that interrelatedness help with taking responsibility as well as letting go of too much responsibility? So how do you balance that out?
Obviously it's a journey, the work, and I think the thing is that um, you can't force people to make sense and meaning in a particular way. You can only create the opportunities through mapping, through questions, through helping people learn to make sense in new ways through particular different scaffolds. But if the individual is just not ready, or something is going on for them which is precluding that, then yeah, you can only do what you can do. You can't force that, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm answering your question though.
Well, I was thinking about a lot of instances where I've seen patterns of learned helplessness in organizations where people just feel it's all the system. The system is rigged, the system is bad, the system is making me like there's very little agency in how I'm part of the system actually, or awareness that I'm part of the system.
Yeah.
So I'm almost, I think this comes back to that initial question that we started with around where is the cross-pollination between working with the individual and taking a systemic perspective, and how these two can inform each other. Is there a point where the individual has to almost go, own their contribution to whatever the system dynamic might be, and in turn be aware that the dynamic itself plays a role in how they show up. So yeah, I'm not sure if I'm even articulating the question properly, but there's something about, it's not us. There's nothing we can do that always stumps me as a facilitator. And I've noticed it over the years working with more and more senior teams, that it happens, this pattern at every single level. You could be working with the board of an organization and they will have their own stories of powerlessness or helplessness, or the system is kind of limiting us.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued by how do you work with those stories when they show up in this work?
Yeah. I think that the answer is different in different contexts, and depending on where people find themselves in the system and what the challenge is that they're facing. So there isn't sort of one way. But if I pick up on the executive piece or the board piece, I was working recently with an executive team of an organization, and I think it's a very large organization, maybe 100,000 people in it, and I think the descriptions of the executive team as I was working with them was, this is ridiculous, things are so inefficient here, the culture is so bureaucratic. It's almost impossible to get things done. Now, this was the executive team.
Yeah.
Talking about the culture. And I just said to them, let's just pause. Yeah. And I said, you are talking about the culture as if it is something that exists passively, independent of you. And there was so much laughter then in the room, because there was this kind of immediate, obviously, there is a knowing at some level, there's an immediate recognition that in some ways is a ridiculous idea, because they, my next kind of invitation was to them was, you're the executive leadership team of this organization. You are describing the culture as if it exists independent of you, as if you're not it. And you are giving away so much of your agency, but also your responsibility.
Yep.
If no one else, who else except you
Yep.
has more agency and ability to shift this?
Yeah. So you called it out. You called
Absolutely.
out the pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sometimes it is just that because the system becomes so self-referential, and the narratives and the ways, the language and the way the system of speaks of itself, and I'm talking about that subsystem of the exec team. I think that it's just a sort of provocation that's needed and an invitation to be able to kind of step back from how you're making sense here and how
Yep.
you are separating yourself from the system. And just that as a kind of intervention opens up a whole new conversation, which it did, a whole new dialogue about their role as an executive team in maintaining the culture, and an observation then of how, not because they're bad, not with bad intent, but actually just neutrally how they are taking up a role, which is maintaining and co-creating the emergent culture that they're getting.
Yeah.
And that opened, of course, up lots of exciting possibility for how they could reframe their role, step into a different role in the system, and therefore have some impact in shifting the system that they were a part of, versus changing the culture as if it was something that existed outside of them.
Outside. And as you were talking, I almost had this light bulb kind of pop up in my brain around what you started with, the role, and asking people to map out those assumptions that might have been hidden that are actually informing how they engage in the system, and whether this powerlessness that you might see at the very, very senior levels is actually part of that map. And I imagine that when you make them aware of the map, they'll start to see how the assumption that I'm not creating this culture is impeding me, could potentially be one of those assumptions that are playing out under the surface.
Yeah, at the very least, what the ergonomics work does is help parts of a system, entities or subsystems, see the patterning that they're in and how they are in role of co-creation in circularity of the pattern, versus they are separate from it as if it existed outside of them. And I think what's very important about this idea is that, if we extend it out, we tend to separation as if, this is why I talk about it as organizational ecology, because we tend not to see ourselves as ecologically as part of a system. And even in, the wider ecology in which we operate, one of the biggest problems, I think, is that as humans, as a species, we have tended to separate ourselves from the ecologies in which we are embedded. It's exactly the same in organizational ecologies. People tend to separate themselves and not see themselves as an integral, embedded part of the ecology that they are in, including executive teams. I often ask this question. When I invite executive teams into doing this work and observing the system that they're in, and talking about sharing their hypotheses around how they're viewing the system, how they're making sense of it, and that they tend to talk about it as if they're not in it. 99.9% of the time, Alice, I would say, the work begins with a description of what the problem is, and the problem non-inclusive of self. And just making that move by saying, well, I notice that in your descriptions, you're not including self. That is one of the most essential moves, because it's a move from separation into interdependence, interconnectivity. And if you can make that move in one context, in your organizational context, my hope is that we can then help people make that move. It jumps context. It can become trans-contextual, which is why I think I'm so committed to doing this work in the context of organizations, because I think it doesn't reside and remain there. It can really become trans-contextual, and we need that move out of separation from the system and the ecologies in which we're in, into a deep understanding of interdependence with and interconnectivity with.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that that would actually fuel more responsibility for our role to the bigger picture, and an awareness of also the bigger picture itself?
Yes, absolutely. That this idea that, we are never not of the system.
Yeah.
And that doesn't make us bad or to blame or wrong. It is just an invitation to know, often even with good intent, we are in system co-creation and maintenance.
Yeah.
But our sense making may assume that we have no alternative to that, that we have to be in that role. So being able to kind of step back from that and just see that from a neutral place, not from a place of evaluation, not from a place of judgment, but just simply from a place of noticing, from a neutral noticing. That is an important move for us to make, because I think often when I invite executive teams and leaders into this place, one of the other patterns that I notice is they don't include self. They don't tend to understand the role they're playing or even see self in role, or self. I don't mean individual self either, as an entity, like the exec team as an entity is playing a role. So the leadership system, so to speak. But I think the other really important thing is that they tend to they step into the role as expert evaluator, fixer, and in judgment of. And so the other really pattern we want to help people kind of step into or out of, into a pattern of being able to observe, and out of a pattern of judge, evaluator, fixer.
Yeah.
Which
You
is
said
the
you'd like
automatic.
to. Sorry, no, I interrupted you. May I finish your thought?
Well, I think that the automatic kind of expectation of role of leader is the invitation is to be able to see the problem, diagnose it, analyze it, look for this, what's the problem, what's the root cause, fix. And we invite leaders into the fixer, the solution provider, etc. And I think that's where organizations pull people developmentally into their more expert achiever selves, rather than actually, let's just observe how things are and what could be different, which is a move and a pull for people into their more redefining discovery, self, and then seeing what I can learn here, what can I learn about my own meaning making and how others are giving meaning and how mine connects to theirs. And so this is an invitation in an organizational systemic sense, which I believe will help provide the scaffold for people into this more redefining, transforming way of making sense. But it's not at the current time the invitation from most organizations of leaders. The invitation is much more into the expert achiever way of being.
Yeah. Or I'm also noticing a bit of a schizophrenic pull at times. We want leaders to be very strategic and very capable to sense into the system, but also be the fixer and solve and put out the fires, and potentially do both at the same time, which feels to me like there's almost this noble, more post-conventional kind of intention, which is partly why adult development, I think, has become so popular as of late, where you've got all these at times feels a bit like hype. We want everybody to operate from very late stages, but in actuality the pull is towards the fixing and the solving, and there's no sitting in just one worldview anyway. So I feel like the way you go about this work really honors the messiness and the interdependencies between individual and system in a really beautiful way. And also I felt like you touched without actually naming them, but I'd love to name them, because I feel like in the ergonomics methodology, you've got the 3R pathway, which I find so simple and so insightful, where you talk about rewiring, reframing, and repatterning. So you get to the repatterning, right? You create this conversation that actually challenges current worldviews and creates or invites people into new patterns. And then the question comes, how do you sustain that? Knowing that the pull is towards maybe that fixer solver, and it might not go away after a really insightful workshop or piece of work or project. How do you create that sustainability of this more integrative energy in an organization and this inquiry that you're kickstarting with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's really important that, with the 3 R's, I think the first invitation is what I mean by rewiring is the invitation to leaders and everyone in an organization to go, our preponderance is towards analytical thinking, and that there's this alternative way of seeing, and to provide the kind of understanding of what's different about that and some practices where they can try that on. And not to say that there's all analytical thinking is bad. It's actually saying, actually, here you can hold and see more spaciously. You've got more choice because you can look at it through this analytical lens, but you can also look at it through this more systemic, interconnected lens. So that's sort of one pathway, so to speak, to open new neural pathways around how you make sense of situations. And I'm often saying, well, if you looked at this analytically, it might look like this, but what if you looked at this through a more systemic sense making? What would it be? So it's inviting into this kind of and alternative possibility, the adjacency. I think the patterning provide scaffold for people to see that pattern is relational. It's not just about repeated pattern, but it is about how different parts are taking up roles in relation to each other and the patterning that has come to be. Again, not in judgment, but in an ability to kind of stand back from that. And the important thing with the repatterning is that what I introduce to leaders is this idea that a system is never standing still. A system that is alive with vitality is in continuous reorganization, even if it is towards homeostasis. So you want to be able to see the pattern of interrelationship between the parts. And what are the practices that allow you to do that? So some of them are that when they come together as a leadership team, long after I've left, what I'm giving them is some scaffold to do it, but they would include that practice in their monthly or weekly meetings. They may include it in what I call kind of growth edge sessions for the system, where they come together every 8 to 12 weeks to uncover and discover the patterning and to talk about how it could be different. So there are a whole lot of wiring in new practices, new patterns, which are adaptive, which are give this leadership teams the language and some of the practice which allow them to be in continuous viewing of themselves.
Yeah. So you give them a scaffold for actually maintaining and being or doing this work long term.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it would possibly begin with me being in the room, providing that, being the kind of systemic coach or, nudger, and often, intervening in the system, helping kind of explore and put forward alternative possibility. But, over time, this is a practice that leaders must embed in their ways of being for themselves. But, if there aren't those practices, which are just the fast kind of practices embedded in organizations, we need to offer them in order to create the spaces for that. And, I think it's another way for us to create deliberately developmental organizations without us actually speaking about doing that at an individual level. It's about creating contexts where individuals collectively are invited into an ability to step back and hold as object themselves in relation to others.
This speaks to a question that I hold, and it's a bit of an obsessive question that sounds so weird when I say it. I keep asking myself, how can I make myself redundant so my clients don't need me? That is, I think, in my worldview, it's a really great measure of success. And I feel that's a very tricky it's a tricky proposition because I always wonder what helps change stick. And also speaks a little bit about you as a practitioner and your willingness to let go of work and really support your clients to do the work without you. So that's maybe in itself perhaps a different conversation. But on this question of what helps change stick, what I'm hearing you say is practices help change stick, practices that become embedded in the way teams and the organization itself works, that help the system continue to witness itself way beyond the moment you've left it. Mm-hmm. What helps people, continue to practice those practices? Are there other elements that you've noticed in your work with organizations that, help and support this ongoing, deliberately developmental energy to continue playing out?
Yeah, I think that, I think more and more what I'm learning is, and what I'm working on more and more is, what do those scaffolds look like?
Yeah.
What are the sets of questions that we can leave behind? What is the language that or the frameworks that we can leave behind? And so I think this is a kind of growth edge for me and my work, Alice. A beautiful question. I think historically a lot of my work has been much more to go in and help leaders and organizational systems repattern themselves and reorganize themselves and bring about the adaptive shifts that they need to make for them to thrive and be successful. More and more, as this work grows and the need for it grows, because the adaptive requirements is exponential, the complexity, complex challenges that organizations are facing are exponential, and also the nature of the form organizations are taking are much more complex. So in many ways, the challenge now is, how do we create organizations that are less reliant on consultants and coaches and more self-reliant, that we actually build these in to the organization? The challenge for me is, what do those scaffolds look like? What do I need to leave behind that they can do more and more of this work themselves? And one of the things that is emerging, which I'm working on, is some of these frameworks which you're referring to, which are kind of useful guardrails or enabling constraints. I think I would talk about them as, which help people do the work or look at the organizational systems that they're in through these lenses. So the 3 R's, the rolling system triangle, that, Irving Borwick first developed, how to kind of make that more practical, that there are some scaffold and toolkits around language which help a system become object to itself. And what are some of the questions and the tools and the practices? So there is a whole body of work which I think we need to create, which is going to enable organizations to be able to make these moves and to embed these systemic adaptive practices into the organization. Kind of, I want to say DNA, but I don't think DNA is the right word, because in some ways that kind of assumes talking about the organization as if it were a living human entity, which it's not.
Yeah, it's not.
But, into its sort of patterning, so that it can become a more self-reflective learning system, I think is the goal, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think enough scaffold exists. I think there is a requirement for us more and more to emerge what this body of work looks like to enable this way forward.
Yeah. This also makes me think of who the people are who, and I know ideally the whole organization should be the holder of this kind of ongoing process of self-awareness. In my own experience, there usually are certain people who seem to be like the holders, the reminders, the truth tellers. They're like, guys, we're kind of, let's get back to this practice. So I often wonder, what role do key people in the organization who believe in the value of this way of seeing the world, or in the value of holding on to practices of inquiry, of collective inquiry in the long run, how do we find those people? How do we support them? If we think, you might not share this view, that those people are important to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very important question. And of course, I would come back to this idea of role, because
Yeah,
I think one of the most important ways that we can enable this work to stick in organizations is to invite leaders and leadership teams into seeing it as their role,
as
to
their
do
work,
this work as the
yeah,
work. And
yep,
so the very a very critical part of the ergonomics theory and practice is this idea that role drives behavior, that our behavior emerges from who we are, but our behavior also emerges from our sense of role in context, in system. If I'm in role of partner in my system of marriage, in that context, I behave in a particular way. If I go down the hall and engage with my children, and I step into role of parent and I'm engaging parent to child, my behavior changes instantly. If I engage with my mother who might be visiting from South Africa and I'm in that contextual and in that system of relations, my behavior changes because I'm in role of child and the system of relations shifts my behavior. I think it's really critical to understand that if we are going to have a growth of this work, what we need to invite leaders into is to see that this is a vital role that they have to play in their organizational context. And as much as their role is to be experts and leading people, actually their role is as important to be system leaders in the sense of creating the conditions for the system to be able to observe itself, to enable to shift itself.
yep,
And what I'm calling actually inviting leaders into role of organizational ecologists, and to know that this is as important a role that they hold as kind of, meeting shareholder returns, or that this is a role that they need to occupy if they are going to help the organizations thrive now and into the future. So it's a role not to rely on finding the people, but actually paradoxically gifting that role and helping leaders understand that that's a role that they have as an imperative.
yeah,
Not only leaders, HR as well, or P&C teams. Often I'm working with them, and there's such a pull from P&C teams to be focusing on people, on what makes them up and what makes them tick, and addressing individual challenges. And in some ways, with not bad intent, they pull the system out of a systemic adaptive pattern. And so the invitation also is to P&C practitioners and P&C teams to kind of step into this role of creating the conditions to see for organizational systems and organizational ecologies to be seen, to be able to adapt and shift themselves. And that role is quite a different role. And if people don't see it as their role, if leaders and other teams don't see it as their role and as a vital part of the daily work, then I think we'll be less successful. But if we can help leaders and P&C teams and organizational consultants as well know that this is work that is required for organizations to thrive now and into the future, then I think we've got more chance of people being curious about, if I were to occupy that role, which I know is mine, how would I do that?
yeah.
So it's not something we're pushing in, but there's an invitation and a curiosity and an imperative to learn how to do that.
Yeah. This lights me up hearing you say this, because I deeply, deeply believe that we can't really change anyone and anything without having that awareness that it is me. I am the work, in a sense, if I'm a leader in that system. And I also am aware of how daunting that idea is, because and I remember a leader from a government organization recently said, what are we going to do? Like, all of us are going to become facilitators and psychologists and therapists. Well, no. But there's an element of becoming, actually, I believe, that is implied in what you're saying, where you do take on a bit of a role of a facilitator and inquirer and perspective holder, or inviting other people to hold perspective that might not be part of your job description in your actual business role.
And I just want to say that we are definitely not inviting leaders into role of therapist. Neither are we, in some ways, I think paradoxically, we have to give up this idea that this work is about doing therapy at a personal level. It's actually paradoxical to that. It is about helping people not change themselves, but step into a different role systemically, and that actually you can change role in system and change behavior with much more ease, with much more speed, actually, and with much more, I think, ethical integrity than trying to change people. Right? You can create the conditions where people can seek to change themselves. And I think that is a much more important idea. We can reframe people's roles in system with more integrity and offer that as an alternative possibility. And I want to say that that's an important distinction with this work. And
because then vertical development, in a sense, at the individual level, emerges as an outcome of you creating the right conditions in the system for people to be able to grow individually.
Right. And absolutely. And I think if we go in with this kind of higher than thou idea, that it's our role to grow people developmentally, in some ways we're actually putting brakes into the system. But if we see our role as creating the contexts and the systems in which growth can occur, actually growth occurs through contextual means anyway, naturally. So maybe the work much more is to create the possibilities, the conditions, the context in which growth can occur. And, either at the system level or at the individual level. But then it's for the individual to do their own growing and their own fitting in. Then it is some kind of elitist idea that, we can in some way have to grow people vertically up some continuum in some teleological way, which is, I think, deeply problematic, right?
Deeply problematic. And I know this was the first almost thing we jumped into before we started this recording, that for developmental work and systems work to actually both contribute to shifting organizations in a positive direction, we might need to let go of some of these limiting assumptions. And this is one, that you do something to people to grow them. And even in listening to you, what comes up for me is, and it's from a different space, but I think very related in spirit, is Maria Montessori. She had this idea that individuals have she called it horme, the life force of growth, of development, and the whole Montessori educational system, which I'm a parent of a Montessori kid and perpetually fascinated by what we can learn from that space that can be taken in organizations. The whole idea was, how do you create a school where the natural capacity of children to develop is unleashed by the context? So the whole work of that system is actually, how do teachers get out of the way intelligently, meaningfully, intentionally, in a way where kids can actually thrive? So perhaps if I connect this back to what you were saying, is how do we actually learn to get out of the way and stop intervening in pushing or pulling, and actually become more of gardeners, like gardeners creating a thriving, a context where people can thrive, and that natural unfolding of growth can happen, do what it does when you let it unfold rather than put barriers to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical, and I think it's a critical kind of question around where the individual and the organization
Intersect.
come together, and
Yep.
yeah, rather do um, work at the system level and create the conditions for the system itself to become a self-reflective learning system. And that will create the conditions and the pool, I believe, for individuals to grow as well. Yeah. I think the beautiful thing about that as well, Alice, is the idea that if we try and change people, first of all, that's very hard to do. But secondly, one individual at a time, we cannot scale the work.
There's only so much you can do.
There's only like the constraint that kind of, assumes is so limiting that constraint that is built into that set of assumptions. But if we can create organizations which are context for growth and context for self-reflection at a system level, then I think the ability for scale for individuals and adults to grow is
Is
exponential
exponential.
in
Yeah.
so many ways, So
Yep.
I think practically, it invites less resistance. Practically, it invites more opportunity. And, if we hold a systemic assumption that the system patterning, the practices in a system are influential in people's individual behavior as much as who people are and what they're made of, then I think, and I deeply hold that assumption, then I think that, that invites, again, furthermore so that we create the systemic conditions, which invite people into new ways of thinking, new ways of being. And I think that is less reliant on having to change individuals.
Individuals.
And I think one piece that's really important about this work that I think is useful to introduce is that subsystems or entities, if we tend to see organizations as ecologies or ecosystems, they tend to self-organize into subsystems or entities. And what do I mean by that? An exec team is a subsystem, HR might be one, etc. And a lot of where the boundaries are drawn are arbitrary, but they are necessary boundaries in order for the system to kind of be in flow. And I think what's important about that is that subsystems or entities take on roles as much as individuals. And that if we...
It's a fractal, right? There is a bit of a fractal nature to it, the system and
Yes.
the subsystem, and then the individual themselves and going up and down.
Yeah, and a subsystem could be a subsystem of two, a relational kind of contract between a CEO and a member of their team, or a CEO and a chair. That is a subsystem, and that relational entity has enormous impact. Patterning there has enormous impact on the wider, but a subsystem could also be an exec team. And why I'm introducing this idea is that I think it's not just individual leaders that we are inviting into this role. We're inviting executive teams, leadership teams, boards into taking up this role as well.
Yeah.
And
as a collective, as a subsystem, taking on a certain role in the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I believe that is extremely helpful as well, because it's less reliant on individuals having to take that on their shoulders alone.
Yep.
But actually we can help leadership teams as subsystems or entities, or leadership systems, extended leadership teams, exec teams, boards, as the leadership and governance system, hold that as a role that they occupy as a leadership system.
Yep.
And then that doing this work becomes even more easeful and powerful, because it's embedded in the practice of the system, the leadership system, rather than relying on individuals to take that on individually.
I think I've just actually I have a very concrete example of what you're describing, where actually all of these dimensions seem to interplay. I'm working with a CEO of a publicly listed company, who's his company that he's grown to that point. So he's been on this journey as an entrepreneur, and now the CEO and in a kind of a new role of holding a publicly listed entity. And this individual has gone through a really transformative time in his own life, through some really, really hard personal challenges that have made him question a lot of the assumptions he was making individually. So nobody pushed him into a growth journey. Life pushed him. And in a recent conversation, he was thinking about, his relationship with his board and how that subsystem is actually now impacting the culture of a company in a way that he's starting to question. Right. So it just made me think that it's just such a beautiful, if you look at all of these dimensions and stop trying to pick one as the thing to solely work on exclusively and go, no, this is the only lever, you start to see the intersections where, individual reflection actually leads to more awareness of the system. And then the subsystem, in this case, executive team and board kind of working together, then start to impact the broader system and vice versa. So I think there's a lot to be said about just being curious and noticing our own attachments to just one angle, one way, one entry point into this work.
Yeah. I think that, what you're describing is a beautiful example of the work, because what is becoming visible to the CEO, it seems to me, is that the role that the board may have played historically in one context, that he in some ways might have contracted for, the system and the context has changed, and his map of the role of the board has shifted, but the board has not made that shift themselves. And so there's incoherence in the system, which is having an impact on what emergent culture you're getting. All of that is kind of systemic description, which is starting to become visible. And, the minute that this becomes visible, then you can kind of look for, where is my map incoherent with the maps of the members of the board or the board as an entity? And then how do I intervene to repattern this relational system? Such a great example.
So maybe this is a good point in the conversation to address a bit of what might be a bit of an elephant in the room in the adult development and systems space, where it almost feels at times that practitioners in these two spaces hold to their space, individual perspective or the systems perspective, as the thing. And I know what brought us together in curiosity in this conversation to begin with is that we both, I believe, share the view that there's a lot to learn from the other perspective. So in my example with my client, there's an individual, there's a team subsystem and system perspective. And I'm curious, you hold and do a lot of work in the systems perspective. What's the role you see for the individual work? How do you see that intersection?
Yeah, absolutely critical. And I think that, sometimes because a lot of the focus in development is often on the individual, I tend to kind of pull more into emphasizing the systemic. And I think obviously there is a critical place to work both with individuals and with the system, and the individual in relationship to the system. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing, and I think is very important to do, is also working with individuals in their role, in the context in which they're in, helping them make sense of their own meaning making and where they see themselves in relation to others in the system, and being able to make that subject-object move themselves. So it is critical to be working at a multiplicity of levels and in multiple ways, both at the individual level, at the subsystem level, at interrelationship between subsystems, at the whole organizational level, and knowing that it's very important to be helping individuals make the move, but also doing these moves at, other parts of the system. So sometimes it may come across that there is a invalidation of the individual work, but it is absolutely an and I think it's really critical to create spaces for individuals to be able to do that work themselves, and being able to provide support and scaffold to individuals to do that simultaneously is absolutely critical.
Yeah, this almost makes me wonder, and I know there are a lot of practitioners listening to this podcast who might be in different spaces and doing different types of work, maybe facilitation, maybe internal learning and development or coaching. I think it's an interesting question for us as practitioners that emerges from what you've just said. What is the map? So if I were to draw my own role map in how I see the role that I play for my clients, what would be the energies that show up in that map? Is there something I'm missing? And I know for a long time, a lot of my work has been focused on the individual. And as time has gone by, I've opened up more curiously to, whoa, this individual is not in isolation. And how can I, as a practitioner, learn more about the system and how the system plays a role? So it's interesting to reflect on what our own blind spots might be that fuel our allegiance to just one angle. So thank you for holding both. It's a great invitation for reflection for myself and hopefully others too.
Yeah, beautiful. I love what you're saying. And I think being able to step back from our own maps as consultants and coaches, and you reminded me of something Irving said early on to me, which I often quote, which is, leaders and ourselves, we tend to solve the problems we know how to solve. And, we become our own constraint. If we think our role is purely to work with individuals, then we kind of tend to miss the system. But if we think our role is to work with the system, we may tend to miss the individual. So I think it's really beautiful to kind of continually hold the and in this space, and to be able to bring the and into the work, and not to kind of over index on either one. And I'm very aware of myself trying to not overly compensate for the individual emphasis by kind of leaving out the importance of working at the individual level as well. Yeah, so thank you for that, Alice. Really important.
Yeah, I feel like we could be talking for many more hours, and you've pulled so many beautiful threads and opened up so much reflection for me, Joan. And I'm sure that'll be something that a lot of the people listening will be thinking about, and they'll probably take. I'm always curious and invite people to comment when they listen to the episode and kind of go, where did your attention go, and how does that connect with your reality? As we come to a close, I'd like to ask you did touch on it, but I'd love to know, what is the fire in your belly around this work? This is your life's work. You've spent so much time building it and refining it and progressing it. What's driving you to do this work? What's your hope for it going forward?
That's beautiful question. I think there are many things. I think when I first got the glasses, this understanding of being able to see organizations as complex systems, and myself in it, and also myself in my family system at that time, and the role that I was playing and the pattern that I'd been caught in. That was so liberating for me on so many levels, both professionally and personally. And since I've been doing this work for the last 30 years, I get that consistent feedback around how liberating it is, helping individuals and teams and organizational systems break out of their self-limiting constraints, and how they've come to be and the possibilities that emerges. So on a personal level, on a professional level, knowing how deeply liberating that can be is the fire. But I think there is a bigger piece, which is around, the increasing complexity we are creating in our organizations with digital, where, there is more and more requirement for people to be managing complexity, self in complexity, no longer in one job, but in a multiplicity of roles. And I think the wider context of the complex adaptive challenges we face with climate, with generative AI, with post-pandemic reintegration of living in a networked world without being physically present to each other. All of those are requiring much more of us and much more of this work. And so I feel some anxiety almost to kind of put this work out in the world more and more so that we can actually address some of these big adaptive challenges we face. And I think that organizations offer us, what I learned early on, my first learning was that organizations offer us the context and the domains in which we can grow into this. And so I just want to do this more and more and provide more and more scaffold for leaders and organizations to be able to learn their way into this way of being.
Yeah, I love that. And that deeply resonates with my own drives for being in this work in the first place. And I'm so grateful for you, Joan, in the world, and for your wisdom and for your curiosity to reach across the aisle and cross-pollinate and explore what those cross-pollinations might look like. There's a lot of wisdom and courage in holding your own work lightly. And I think that's something I watch you do and I learn from. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And maybe I'll just close to say this, that I think one of our deepest challenges as a species is that we don't hold ourselves in interdependence and interconnectivity, and both with the ecology in which we're in and in relation to each other. And so I guess the higher purpose with all of our work needs to build that deep relational interdependence that I think will be really important scaffold for all of us and our whole ecology. So I think that's essential work for all of us to be doing individually and collectively.
Yeah. And if I hear what you're saying under the words is also, can we do this in the research and consulting space as well as in the organizations that we are working with? Which for me is such an exciting prospect. Or I may be projecting my own hopes here into your previous share, but I think there's a lot to learn from the different angles with which we're approaching this type of work. And the more of these dialogues we have, the more enriched I believe we can all be. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for the opportunity to have this dialogue with you, Joan.
Yeah, I'm deeply grateful too to have this conversation. Thank you, Alice. And cheekily, I want to say that more and more I've been talking at conferences of change management and things like that, because I think in some ways we need to disrupt the field. So we need to build this alternative possibility to our toolkit that is out there.
Amen to that. Thank you, Joan, so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your beautiful work and this podcast opportunity. Thanks.
Wow, this has been such a rich conversation. My brain is still buzzing from the perspectives Joan has raised, and in fact, we found ourselves continuing the conversation a good while after we stopped recording. One thing we were reflecting in our dialogue afterwards was how interesting it gets so easy to favor one perspective, individual, or system over the other. Even for practitioners who do a lot of work in both spaces, our preferences, our intellectual lens, our history easily seems to pull us in one direction or another. So that effort to really hold the whole polarity in our awareness is constant work for all of us. For myself, I notice my passion for mining the depths of the human mind and my almost inherent leaning towards exploring individual mindsets. I also reflect on how this preference is linked to my own history, Growing up in a highly individualistic society where some of the prevalent beliefs were that success is a function of individual effort, or that you could not really trust or rely on other people, and often the system, meaning the social political system, was an enemy to fight against. So, in a sense, you, the individual, would be better off not considering yourself part of the system. So paradoxically, it was the system I was embedded in that shaped my views around how interesting individual development actually is. I notice how in my own practice I have to actively step back from these entrenched mindsets to shift my awareness towards the collective, to notice what happens between people, not just within them. I have a lot to learn about how systems work, and talking to experts such as Joan is such an enriching and thought-provoking space for me to be in. I also wonder how others who might have grown up in more collectivistic or community-oriented cultures might have a completely different awareness of their belonging to a system or the interdependencies they are part of. I wonder how experts who study systems and focus all their research and practice on working at the collective level might in turn grow from staying curious about individual experiences of growth and change. I also wonder, more broadly, how we might foster more dialogue between what often seems like two camps: advocates for individual-focused approaches to growth versus advocates for systems approaches. Leaning towards each other rather than away from or against each other might just be a developmental step in itself for all of us. The conversation with Joan also led me to reflect on the systems I myself am embedded in, the roles I play in my family system, in my work, but also as a member of a broader community of practice and research. I'm very curious how our conversation has landed with you. What does your role map look like? What are you noticing about your own leanings within this polarity of individual versus and system? What personal reflection questions has this dialogue sparked? If you're listening to this on one of the podcasting apps, please go to the episode page on our Substack at verticaldevelopment.education and share your comments. I'd love to engage in a broader conversation we can all learn from. I hope this was fun and interesting and stimulating. And until next time, I hope you stay curious, conscious, and wise.